Welcome, welcome cuties. Today is Thursday, and much like yesterday's was our recap for the raid that we haven't checked in a couple of weeks, today is also the recap of Mythic Plus that we haven't checked in a couple of weeks. Perhaps this is even more important because what we have also gotten in Mythic Plus, besides the balance tuning, is the cross faction, right? We have now gotten way more players, particularly the Alliance ones, being able to join the ranks of Horde players in Mythic Plus. We have also already seen the effects of this. As you look at here, there are already quite a few groups, quite a few high-end, high-level groups already moving to the Alliance for particularly powerful racials, which is something we have known for a while now. The Alliance has not been less played than the Horde because they have the worst racials. That's not been true in several expansions. In fact, in Mythic Plus, Alliance races are quite easily the better racials for competitive groups. So let's go and take a look at how the meta has been shaping and continuing over these past few weeks that we haven't kept track of, in search of some meaningful changes. Perhaps taking a look at some of the specs that got buffed in this patch. We have gotten Mistweaver, we have gotten Windwalker, we have gotten Outlaw, we've gotten Beastmaster, we've gotten Arcane Mage. So perhaps one of these is going to improve their performance. But let's start with none of them because we're starting with tanks. None of them got buffed this patch. So when looking at the plus 20 level, it is yet another good moment to congratulate Blizzard in creating this very, very even and balanced state amongst all tanks. Of course, this is also the caveat: you need to pretend that Protection Warrior does not exist. And once you do, the situation is still very, very balanced. Even going higher in keys, even getting into the 25 range when it comes to tanks, it is obviously a little bit more skewed, right? It is bound to become more extreme, but still, for being high keys, for being in the top 1% of keys, this is still a decent amount of spread amongst specs. It has gotten slightly worse compared to the last time we looked at it, because now Blood Death Knight is even more popular than before, but still, Blood, Prot Paladin, Brewmaster, Vengeance are still quite I would consider this popular enough. Being well above 10%, even actually and in the 15% plus range of popularity in keys higher than 25 should be very good, right? At least I believe it should be. I consider so when it comes to tanks. You have quite the option. For this season, I would say even for this expansion, if you have been a tank, you had a lot of viable options. Once again, Protection Warrior does not exist, so besides that, very good options for tanks. Then you have the healers. The options for healers have not been as varied as the tanks. Last week, the plus 20 keys still saw Shaman as the clear cut ahead of any other spec, but still getting closer and closer to Holy Priest. And this time, now that we look into 9.2.5, Holy Priest has gotten even more close to Resto Shaman. Now the gap is 3.3%. I believe we started looking at this early on into the tier, and Shaman was somewhere in the 18 or 20% advantage over Holy, so now it's just 3%. So very, very narrowed of a gap between the two specs. Also, Resto Druid continues to rise. It has now long since passed Holy Paladin and continues to hold very tightly the third spot amongst healers. The other two healers are not really mentioned in pretty much any way, shape or form, and obviously about the same happens in keys higher than 25. This is when even Resto Druid has to bow to the power of both Holy Priest and Resto Shaman. So up to plus 20 and higher keys, Resto Druid is doing quite fine. He's getting plus the 20% range, but once you get into the highest of keys, it's pretty much just two specs, either Shaman or Holy Priest. None of the others are too seen at this level. Now, melee DPS is quite interesting because it is where we had three of the buffs. We had one to Arms, we had one to Outlaw, and we had one to Windwalker. So, how did things go compared to last time we looked? Well, from last time to this time, what we can see is that Survival Hunter is getting even higher in representation in Mythic Plus keys. We see that other specs that were popular before are still more or less there, so Havoc and Fury Warrior. Outlaw is gaining, okay, technically speaking, Outlaw has almost doubled the representation from 1% to 2%. So that is a massive increase, right? Doubling the representation, great. We're also seeing, by the way, that arms is increasing the representation by 50%, great, and that Windwalker has increased its representation by about 12 or so percent. Also, Windwalker, worth pointing out, was already one of the more popular of melee specs in Mythic Plus, so they had less room to improve. They had less room to increase. Also, when you consider that Outlaw can simply be Subtlety Rogues respecking, Arms can simply be Fury Warriors respecking, whereas Windwalker is much harder to get more players into Windwalker that quickly. So that's the main change in keys in the 20 level range. In the 25, of course, we do have the more extreme of situations where we do see, again, making up for nearly 40% of all of the melee specs you see in Mythic Plus, which is quite high. It's not close to the record, okay? It's not close to a record high of representation, 40%. We have seen worse, and we are about to see worse, but it's still quite crazy to see this popular compared to what we have been used to see the spec in the past few years, really. However, here is where we also get some cool changes, because Outlaw also goes from 0.9 to 3.5. That's like a 400% increase, and then we get Windwalker going from 11 to 16, and currently passing Subtlety and becoming the second most represented melee DPS spec in the higher level of keys. So it looks like I would call them positive changes as well when it comes to the buffs, the balance tuning given to these three specs. Arms, not as much, but Outlaw and Windwalker seem to have benefited decently enough from these buffs in 9.2.5. Lastly, we do have the range DPS. This is the home of the buffs to Arcane and Beast Mastery. No, I'm gonna close the question right there. Beast Mastery and Arcane have not gained about anything, really, in this recap of Mythic Plus. Even through the buff of 9.2.5, they haven't really changed, pretty much. We still see the domination of Destruction and even Demonology, which is still one of the more popular ones. Marksmanship and Frost Mage also are quite the popular specs. Where things start getting grotesque, where things start getting obscene, is where we get into the plus 25 range. We get ourselves a record. We get ourselves the first spec in Shadowlands and one of the first specs ever, 50.1% representation of Destruction Warlock ranged in Mythic Plus. So half of the DPS, half the time you see a ranged DPS in keys at 25 or higher, they are going to be a Destruction Warlock. And it's also worth reminding that despite this massive dominance, Demonology is still the second most popular of the ranged specs. So it is quite the horrible situation for ranged. You really don't want to see this when you take Balance, Elemental, Shadow Priest, and even the Hunter specs, you put them all together, and they don't even get to the popularity of Demonology. And Demonology is 4 times less used and seen than Destruction. That's how bad things are for the other specs. I think that's quite not good, and I am not okay with how Destruction has been left of for the entirety of this season when it comes to Mythic Plus and when it comes to AoE damage so far. On a side note, talking about Mythic Plus, I hope you had a decent push week. This last one has been the best week in recent time for you to push. Fortified, Bursting, and Storming. As you can see here, the success rate of the green line, the green week, which was last week, was quite high, especially in the plus 20 range, right? The plus 20 level to get to 3000 rating, to get the teleports, that range has been super high. Even if you go past that, even if you start getting to the 25 range, it's somewhere in the 15 to 20% higher success chance than the last few previous weeks. So I hope you spent a good time if you were thinking about climbing in Mythic Plus last week, because that was a great week to climb. Especially this week being Tyrannical, Raging, and Volcanic, that's not going to be nearly as good. Now, however, now that we have this overall look for Mythic Plus as well, given the changes to the specs based on the balance tuning that we got in 9.2.5, compared to yesterday's video, compared to the raid video, it is not as much, okay? The growth of the specs in the raid has been much more noticeable than Mythic Plus, and that's because this was Blizzard's intent. Those buffs were intended to improve the single target damage. So obviously that type of buff is going to show up much more. It's going to be much more visible in the raid, not as much in Mythic Plus, but even in Mythic Plus, we have seen some decent growth to Windwalker and Outlaw and slightly to Arms Warrior as well. So buffs did a decent job at putting some specs to be a little bit more relevant. Question is now, of course, why were so few of these changes happening, why we didn't have any meaningful nerfs happening. And then the last question, which is going to be, is any of this going to continue in Season 4? So are we actually going to get another round of balance tuning before the season actually opens? Because we have gotten patch 9.2.5 now. Thankfully, thank you. I'm sure all Alliance players being happy to be able to get cross-faction already, but the season is going to open in, what are we gonna say, 2 months, right? My guess was, I think my guess was September, mid-September was the guess, so I don't know. In a few months, that's why I still hope that we eventually are going to get some more changes for the last season. It's gonna be quite boring if we enter the last season of this expansion with the exact same situation as we have now, right? The last season, especially because it's going to be a shorter one, the beta of Dragonflight is going to be full running. Players are going to start getting excited about different specs and classes and whatnot to try for the next expansion. They might want to try it ahead of time in Shadowlands. So I hope we're going to get a little bit of a shake-up in the next season in terms of balance tuning, especially because it's not even going to be an official one. There's not going to be a proper, race to world first. There's not going to be a proper MDI Blizzard sanctioned tournament. There's not going to be Hall of Fame. So perhaps being a little bit more of a laid back season, a little bit more of an informal season, Blizzard might be more willing to bring us some more meaningful changes, right? Some more buffs to some of these less played spec for almost this entire expansion, like Feral Druid, like Frost DK or Unholy DK at this point, we should say. Arms Warrior as well, a Rat Paladin, there's a handful of spec that might get a pretty decent bump by the end of this expansion. So I guess good job, fine. 1/2 thumb up for the balance tuning of this patch because it did add some effects on the specs that were buffed. Still, I'm hoping for more, and I'm hoping that as we get closer to the release of the next season, the last season, we will be getting some more balance tuning because the situation is getting quite stale, especially in some of the roles, as we have seen, particularly in Mythic Plus. The ranged role in Mythic Plus is quite in the sad state. I would like to see some variety applied to that role. So with this being said, we can close our recap of Mythic Plus as well. Thank you guys for watching this video, which also requires you to like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel. For this time around, I'm going to let all of the happy bees getting buffed by this patch, Outlaw, Windwalker, Arms, Arcane, BM, subscribe to the channel. As an extra, as a plus, I am also available on Twitter to follow, somewhere right here, and you can also subscribe to my Patreon down here, which will give you access to my Discord channel, where you will be able to interact with me, ask some questions you might want answered, maybe some tips or suggestions about something. You're free to ask. I'm gonna be available there every day. So with this being said, thank you guys for watching the video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, this video took longer than intended. I need to go eat. It's already late. God damn it.